Good morning, English 149. This is Grant. I hope you had a good first day of class. I tried to make it easy just to kind of read through the syllabus on the website and to get ready for the semester. So a few of you haven't completed the 3 tasks, and again, they're due at 5 p.m. today from yesterday's homework. So if you're having trouble making that time, just email me and we'll work something else out. But just make sure that you do all 3 links. So making sure that you're doing the survey, making sure that you're filling out a day to do the podcast, and I'll get to that in just a sec. And making sure you're just giving me your availability so we could chat face to face. I think it's good to kind of talk to one another face to face rather than me just talking into this camera in my office here. So with the podcast, they're really your opportunity to discuss what you want to discuss. So they could be something from class, they can be something out of class. Just if it's something from out of class or you want me to read a fan fiction, just email it to me a couple days before so I can be prepared. I'm going to give you a piece of software that you're going to install, and it's going to give us the ability to kind of live podcast together. And then at the end, when I'm done editing it, you can decide whether or not you want the podcast to be a part of the official ECL podcast, or if you just want to keep it between us. Either way is fine with me. Okay. So you'll notice for homework tonight, I have you starting to post in the forums. And so tonight you're going to be reading Jameson's book. It's one of the first works of theoretical fan fiction, theory of fan fiction. So that's going to establish kind of all of our terms. And according to what I've read in the survey so far, it's a few of you just need a lot of refreshers just on what general terms are, and that's what I'm going to hopefully go through today and give you a good overview of just some small terms that we're going to be using back and forth. Okay. So you'll also notice for forums, I posted a video on how to post to the forums, but again, you'll see there's a link to our Instagram account for the class. So if you like to do something more visual, or even just like, opening up a fan fiction and then talking over it, that's fine too. Whatever you want to do, I'm really good with. Just I want to see you interact with the text in some way, okay? So today you're gonna see me talk about Robinson Crusoe, and it is a book that I study quite a bit. It's an important book, especially thinking about now, it's one of the first works of kind of the height of the British Empire when slave trade started to kind of explode in the Atlantic. And it's one of those myths that kind of propagate, that justify the expansion of the British Empire. And so I think it's really important to kind of ask why we keep on telling this story. It's not a particularly good story, but it's the story of empire. So I'm really interested in those sorts of things. Okay. So why fan fiction, right? Why, of all the other classes, a few of you noticed like no one else really talks about it. And it's one of those pieces of fiction that is easily cast as illegitimate. But I think it's something really important. And, I think literary studies are starting to really pay attention to adaptation. And I think in my research, you can't look at adaptation without looking at fan fiction, right? Because what I hope to explore in this class is the line between fan fiction and adaptation is really, really thin. And what we think of as legitimate literature and what we think as illegitimate literature really doesn't matter. So fan fiction, why? Because it's adaptation. So, okay, so Zizek here in this slide, he is a contemporary philosopher. And the reason why I think adaptation and fan fiction is a good way of studying literature and culture is he says, one of the best ways to detect shifts in ideological constellation is to compare consecutive remakes of the same story, right? So if you have like a constant and you have things that change, we can ask questions like, well, why did those things change, right? Like, what was the motivation to change them? And we can do the same thing with fan fiction, right? Like, why would you change certain aspects of the text? Why would you have two characters be romantically involved that weren't originally romantically involved, right? And what does that say about our culture? Okay, so example of Robinson Crusoe. You probably haven't read the book, but you definitely encountered a adaptation. Okay, so there's tons, right? Swiss Family Robinson, Lost in Space, The Martian. There was even an animated film a couple years ago named Robinson Crusoe. So it's a text that continues to see a lot of adaptations. Now, there's not a lot of fan fiction about it. There was fan fiction in the 19th century where some people kind of saw themselves as, oh, what if I got stranded on the island with Robinson Crusoe? Or someone wrote a romantic novel about Robinson Crusoe and Friday falling in love. So it has this tradition of both adaptation and fan fiction, right? And I think one way we can think about kind of what's going on right now is ways in which adaptation can be subversive, okay? So Paul Gilroy, who has a famous book called The Black Atlantic, and Paul Gilroy is looking at how certain motifs change in each culture and how you can create a culture outside of the nation state through these adaptations and through these changed stories, right? And so there's very powerful aspects to adapting and creating fan fictions in terms of identity and in terms of community, okay? So again, one of the other works I do is Jane Eyre. We're not going to go over it, but Jane Eyre has a ton, even some science fiction. If you've never heard of the Eyre Affair, it is a science fiction version of Jane Eyre. So, there's a lot of different adaptations for even like a love story, okay? And one of the aspects of Jane Eyre that you're going to come across, it's mentioned in a lot of our texts, is Wide Sargasso Sea. And Wide Sargasso Sea tells the story of Bertha Mason, who can't speak in the novel, right? Because she is completely erased by Bronte. And Spivak here, when she says the subaltern cannot speak, you'll hear a lot, it's called post-colonial literature, where a story is rewritten, and it's rewritten from the perspective and centering of a marginalized person in the text, right? And so adaptation in fan fiction is also a way that we can bring voices to texts that, don't give voice to marginalized communities, right? So in Robinson Crusoe, there is a South African book called Foe, which really centers the story of Friday. Okay. So Frankenstein's another example, right? We see it all the time. And, it's a work that kind of talks about technology and science. And so we always had this uneasy relationship to it. And one of the pictures here is Penny Dreadful. And you can think of Penny Dreadful as this kind of legitimate-ish fan fiction, because a bunch of these characters fall in love with one another, or fight with one another, that wouldn't normally be involved, right? Like Dorian Gray and Frankenstein and Dracula would not kind of talk with one another, right? So you can think of Penny Dreadful as this kind of fan fiction, but it's legitimized because of course it's on Showtime and it has all of this money associated with it. All right, the other thing that I want to kind of review as I go through adaptation and I'm reading things is the study of semiotics. So Roland Barthes, if you haven't come across him, you will in this class. He is famous for Death of the Author, but he's also famous for thinking about how each work has two levels, right? There's a literal, there's kind of the plot, what happens, and then there's the concealed, right? And so sometimes just changing the plot or just changing these surface elements really can change the way that the text is viewed and consumed, and its potential to change culture and people. So the kind of core question that we're asking, right, and this is why fan fiction isn't studied, is we like to say the text is contained in the book, right? We open up a book, there's words on a page, and we close the book, the text is in that bound matter. But, especially Frankenstein, if you've seen the movie, the book is nothing like any of the movies that we normally watch. And so if you've seen a movie, it's going to influence the way that you view the book. So the book doesn't have this kind of easy bound space, right? There's things that float in and out, right? There's certain works at a time that we think are good, and then later we realized are extremely problematic, right? So the text is always changing, and the text is not just bound up, right? And this is why fan fiction is important, because fan fiction changes the way that the source text is read and consumed. Okay, so one of the big questions that we're going to be asking in the background of this class is one that literary studies is trying to kind of contend with, right? Are texts shaped by their authors or by the culture that consumes them, right? Is authorial intent, does that oversee any kind of play by the reader? And we're going to be really investigating this question. And I think it's a really interesting and good question to ask, because it gets into a question of, well, who owns works, right? This is why I say copy wrong, because copyright usually says, someone owns a work. And there's a copy left field that believes that once something's out in the public, everyone can kind of remix and use it, right? So we're going to be kind of looking into why that could be problematic or why that could be good. So one example of this is Robinson Crusoe in the character Friday, right? Friday in the source text is a native of the island, and he becomes Crusoe's, what we would call companion, but he really is Crusoe's slave on the island, okay? And so there's a very famous, and the New York Times even suggested this was a movie to watch during quarantine. There's a Cary Grant movie named His Girl Friday, which Friday is now a woman. And so you have to kind of ask, well, what's the history there? Like, why at this point in time do we transform this character from a native of an island that is enslaved and then to a woman, right? Like, why at this period of time would we make this switch, right? So that's why I want you to ask when these fan fictions, when you read them, when you see them, like, why this particular fan fiction at this time? And especially if it grows in popularity, right? Because then it's hitting a moment. Okay, so I think it's best to kind of review some terms as we move forward, right? And two of the terms that really get floated around a lot is like, what exactly, when I say adaptation, what does that mean? And what is intertextuality? That's another term that we use a lot. And I'm going to pull from Linda Hutcheon, who's at Toronto. Her book, A Theory of Adaptation, is kind of one of the seminal works of adaptation studies. So let's look at some terms here, right? So for Hutcheon, we have two forms of adaptation. There's adaptation in media, which she says is an altered or amended version of a text, musical composition, one adapted for filming, broadcasting, or production on the stage from a novel or similar literary source, right? So that's what we're going to be looking a lot in this class is, what happens when someone changes the medium, right? Like if it's a Harry Potter fan fiction, what happens when it's a Harry Potter like film or comic version, right? And then there's what we oftentimes think of the biological adaptation, right? A process of change or modification. So we think of adaptation in those two ways, and we're really going to kind of zone in on is less of the evolutionary aspect and more of this media aspect, right? So there's 3 criteria for adaptation, okay? So we need to first acknowledge a transposition of a recognizable other work or works. So that means like I'm using Romeo or Juliet, or I'm saying, In Fair Verona. I'm signaling, right, that I am doing an adaptation. And when I'm not signaling, when I'm just using like the plot and not saying any of the characters of the setting, that's what we're going to call an appropriation, okay? So an appropriation is this first point, but we're not acknowledging any aspect of the source text, right? Second is a creative and interpretive work of and an act of appropriation or salvaging, right? So we're being creative. We're adapting and retelling the story for a reason. We're not just doing it to make money. And that's where some of these adaptations just don't work, because they need to say something new, okay? Or they need to take a text that maybe has gotten forgotten and make it new, right? HBO had a really interesting adaptation of Native Son, and they tried to kind of make it futuristic to see if, the text could have that kind of power again. And then an extended intertextual engagement with the adapted work, right? So it's not the fact that we just set it up, but the work continues work of continually adapt the text as we go through narrative time, okay? The other concept I want to introduce to you that's related to adaptation and intertextuality, right? Intertextual elements are those kind of little images or words, right? Like to be or not to be, right? That is an intertextual element because we know what text that comes from. Beauty and the Beast, right? Like a candle, right? Or a clock or a teacup, right? Like those aspects give us the kind of intertextual element. We know what that image or that word or that setting means, right? So that's an intertextual element. So extended intertextual engagement is continuing feeding in those images and words into the text. Okay, so the next term I'm going to introduce to you is called bricolage, and it's from anthropology. It's from a famous anthropologist named Claude Levi-Strauss, not Levi Strauss, like the jeans. And what he says is, we're constantly just reusing the signs and the images that are around us, right? So he looks at it in native tribes and how they make myths and how they build their belief system off of the same types of stories. And we see this all the time with, very similar creation stories or flood stories, right? So there's these kind of elements that are at play that we're always rebuilding. And so that gets into fan fiction, right? Fan fiction is, there's already stuff out there, let's say something new with that stuff.